And now I'd like to introduce the moderator of this debate. Stephen Sinding was Director General of the International Planned Parenthood Federation in London. He had a 20-year career at the U.S. Agency for International Development and served as Senior Population Advisor to the World Bank, and later as Director of Population Sciences Program at the Rockefeller Foundation. He was Clinical Professor of Public Health at Columbia University. Steve serves on a number of boards and works as an international consultant. I'm going to ask him to come to the podium now, and he will introduce both of our debaters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you for those very kind words. And I'd like to, just before I introduce the subject and the speakers, say how enormously grateful we all are to GMALL for the fantastic programs that you've been putting on. It just gets better and better every year, moving from strength to strength. So congratulations, and just look at this audience. I think this is the biggest crowd we've ever had, and it's deservedly so. You're in for a real treat this afternoon. By way of introduction, the mass media has undergone enormous change since most of us in this room were young. Gone are the days of the daily newspaper, 2 major news magazines, and 3 channels of broadcast television news. Now we have multiple all-news, all-talk radio, cable TV channels, blogs, internet sites, social media, and on it goes. Gone is the fairness doctrine that for so many years governed the way in which the Federal Communications Commission tried to ensure balance in journalism. It's now no holds barred, bare-knuckle conflict in the 24-hour news cycle. It's not your Walter Cronkite world anymore. In this new mass media universe, what is the role of media in developing a well-informed public? And how well do the media perform this role? Those are the central questions our 2 combatants will address today. They are, as proposer of the motion, an economist, an author, an online editor and publisher, a Today's Headlines moderator for GMALL, and now the GMALL president, Peter Radford. And opposing Peter, a retired Royal Naval officer, an international civil servant and peacekeeper, a local public affairs guru, a commentator, a columnist, Derek Boothby. And now the rules. The rules are very much the rules of the Oxford Union, the oldest debating society in the world. The Oxford Union has, as you know, been the progenitor of many, many members of the mother of all parliaments, the British Parliament, and the training ground for many of the great statesmen and women of our time and many years before. Each of the presenters will be given 10 to 12 minutes to first introduce and propose the motion, and then to oppose the motion. Following that, we will have 45 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever time permits, for comments by the audience. This is not a Q&A session. This is an opportunity for you to express your views, your opinions, your thoughts on the subject of the motion. Following that, each presenter will have an opportunity of 5 minutes to make a closing argument, and at the end of that, you will vote in favor of the proposer or of the opponent of the motion. Just to remind you, the motion before the meeting is that if the health of a democracy depends upon a well-informed public, the media is failing in its role. To begin, I invite the proposer to come to the podium.
The oracle speaks. Of course it's failing. I mean, I don't know why we're having this debate, really. I'm going to give you a couple of headlines from this morning, just to give you an idea of what the news really is. Number one trending story this morning, CNN, a story about international swimming races being rigged. That's interesting, keeps the public informed. Number two, Fox News talking about a man in Pennsylvania being held on $1 million bail because of some kidnapping. This is really good. Number three, trending story this morning, New York Times, a story called "This Town Melts Down," which is really about the capricious nature. You may have read it. It's I know a lot of New York Times readers out there. It's not the only media. Please remember that. And then number four, Huffington Post, a story about someone who parked his Ferrari in the wrong place. Now, I could stop here because that doesn't say much about our media informing the public. Because as they were writing that, and as those were the key stories this morning, what was going on? The New York Times was breaking, or continuing to break, its story about Donald Trump Jr., which I would have thought was a much more interesting story, but apparently those four outlets didn't. It speaks to what my theme is going to be, we live in echo chambers. We live in information cocoons, as they're called. And I'm going to start off with a quote from Cass Sunstein, who has written a book, very recent book. It's called The # Republic. It's about the role of social media and democracy. He has a very poor opinion of what that is. And this is what he says. In a well-functioning democracy, people do not live in echo chambers or in information cocoons. That's not the opening of chapter 1. That's not the opening of the introduction. That is the first words in the preface of the book. He places so much emphasis on that simple idea. In a well-functioning democracy, people do not live in echo chambers or information cocoons. But we do. All of us do. We live in our own worlds of information. We live in these, what I like to think of as these little gated communities scattered across the information landscape. There's the New York Times community, there's the Fox News community, MSNBC, NBC, Breitbart, InfoWars, WikiLeaks. Yes, WikiLeaks was introduced as a great new thing in journalism in 2010. The list goes on, as Steve already mentioned. We live in an era of mass media. And my argument is going to be built around that. In an era of mass media, no matter how successful each individual part of the media is inevitably doomed to fail. It has to fail. In fact, it's going to fail by its own logic. It cannot make it cannot fulfill its civic role if it's going at the same time to make profit. Now that's a very important argument I'm going to make. In fact, it's kind of, I've originally couched it as a paradox. The more the media succeeds, the more it fails. So let me just get to that argument straight away because we're pressed for time. In an era of, as Steve mentioned, we all like to think back to that old, warm, fuzzy era of Walter Cronkite. You know, dear old Uncle Walter. He defined the news, or rather there were so few outlets in the media that it was very easy to coalesce around a single story. The news was the news was the news. We didn't make up news. We didn't go searching for news. There were just a few outlets, national newspapers, few television, and so on. And it was quite simple. When you saw one article in one place, chances are you're going to read a very similar article in another place. Maybe a different perspective, but at least they were talking about the same thing. Don't we wish that was going on now, as I just pointed out? Ferraris, swimming pools, all sorts of stuff being talked about. The news, in other words, has become a commodity. The news is a business. Media is a big business. It's a for-profit business. And that undermines its role as a civic, it undermines its civic activity. Why? Because in order to survive in a mass market, each media outlet needs viewers, it needs eyeballs, it needs readers, it needs whatever. Volume counts. It needs to sell advertising. The media exists to sell advertising. It needs volume. How do you get volume? You create news. You create news. If there's no news out there, you go find some. You dig it up. If the news isn't sensational enough for your voice to be the loudest on the block, then you create some sensation. You create it. News is a manufactured commodity nowadays. It is not the news. It is something else. It's something that's for sale. And when it's big, and that has created the exact market we're in now, the circumstance we're in now. We are living in a media market where there's a race to get the news. If our Twitter in chief tweets at 3 a.m, you cannot be the only news outlet to ignore it. You may want to take the high road. It's silly. It's nonsense. I'm above all of that. I'm a grown-up. But you can't take that risk. You have to go and comment on it. We race immediately into this bizarre, mass-produced, low-content world, full of rumor, full of innuendo, full of half-statements, full of conspiracy theories. Why? Because that makes news. It's good stuff. You can make a headline tomorrow, and you can imagine it in the editorial boardroom, in the editorial rooms. You can't bring this nice story about the puppy. The other guys are talking about Trump. Go get a story about Trump. Come on. And they go and get a story about Trump and they make it up. Or they find something, or they talk to someone who's talked to someone whose uncle said something, maybe whose cousin said something else. They make it up. And we're living in this bizarre world where the news is a manufactured commodity. And that's as simple as that. The New York Times is doing a stellar job of selling news to the New York Times readers. Stellar. But as a New York Times reader, do you know whether that's true? Do you? How do you cross-reference that? In the old days, you could go and pick it up. Okay, I've watched Fox, I've watched New York Times, I've gone to Breitbart, I've read The Economist, that would be me. I've read all these other things. I've spent 24 hours today reading the news. Now I kind of know what's going on. Nobody has that time anymore. We live in echo chambers. And which is exactly what Sunstein said we should not be doing. All right? Now, more than half the people in the world nowadays, in the United States, I should say, get their news through social media. Now, social media was first, when the internet was first brought onto the stage, it was supposed to be this great democratizing phenomenon. Now anybody can publish news. Not just the New York Times, not just the Washington Post. We can all do it. I do it. We all do it. So we had the exact opposite effect. Instead of democratizing the news, it made the news so fragmented, so difficult to penetrate, so difficult to understand, so difficult to locate, and be sure that you know what you're reading is true, that it bred apathy, and it bred a great deal of cynicism. The media now, a study came out yesterday, just yesterday. It was remarkable how the sun, moon, and stars aligned for today. Study was released just yesterday. 85% of Republican voters think that the media is a negative influence in public discourse. That's a long way from them thinking it's a useful thing in terms of civics, the way that we were taught the media is supposed to perform. It's supposed to perform two things: watchdog role, snap at the heels of authority, inform the public, oh no, whatever they're saying in Washington's a load of bogus, here's the real truth. The other thing is act as a forum to allow people to allow minority opinions to be fully out there in public. To create debate, just like tonight. How many newspapers do that? When was the last time that happened? Yeah, exactly. Doesn't happen at all. So we now, they're the two roles that they're supposed to perform, and they can't perform either if they're searching for profit. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't matter how hard they try. This is not a criticism of individual journalists. It's not even a criticism of Fox News, which, by the way, is the most successful of these modern media outlets. It identified a market niche, it identified a product, and it went right at it. It was a brilliant piece of marketing. Well done, Murdoch. Not that I'm particularly fond of it, but there we are. It's a fact of life. The mass media market is a market in which the media cannot perform its civic role. Not at least with ease. Not with running the risk of abandoning profit. It has to go for volume. And let me just give you a couple more facts before I get bumped off here by Steve. How many?
A minute.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It's a long minute. It's a fake minute. Okay? He's lying to us. I want you all to know that. All right. There was just as a matter of luck, what arrived in my book post box this morning was the London Review of Books. Yes, I'm boring. Okay. In it, there's this wonderful article entitled "The Age of Detesting Trump." It's by David Bromwich, who's someone, parenthetically, I really admire. I love this guy's writing. He's a very, very, very good writer. And the entire article, written by someone who is an accomplished journalist, is a criticism of media and how it's failing in its role. The whole thing. These articles, those people who read this thing tend to go on for pages. But one thing stuck out, and I'll finish with that, Steve. It's a quote from Mencken, someone we should all respect on this topic. Here's what Mencken is saying. I have to take my glasses off. Getting too old, guys. There are times and occasions. Is that thing ringing?
That's what it is.
Okay. It's an egg timer. It's not a timer. There are times and occasions when rumor is almost as important as the truth. When a newspaper's duty to its readers requires it to tell them not only what has happened, but also what is reported, what is threatened, and what is merely said. This is Mencken speaking. What I contend is simply that such quasi-news, such half-baked and still dubious news, should be printed for exactly what it is. That it ought to be clearly differentiated from news that, by an overwhelming probability, is true. I put it to you that in this era of mass media, it is impossible for the newspapers, the TV, to perform their civic duty. It's a matter of business logic. They're shaking volume. The media is doomed to fail. You have to support this proposition. Thank you.
Oh dear, he doesn't ramble on, doesn't he? Now, I have very real and deep-rooted respect for my erudite colleague. However, not only does he ramble on, but on this issue, he does suffer from a quite notable and distinct disadvantage of being wrong. He has his dog barking up the wrong tree. I oppose this motion not because, as you may suspect, I'm a great fan of the media. As Thomas Jefferson said in 1806, as for what is not true, you will always find abundance in the newspapers. Is there an exuberance of partisan views and comment in today's media? Yes, there is. And I can be as critical of the media as anyone. Well, perhaps anyone except President Trump and Stephen Bannon. In this heated exchange, there is certainly more than enough blame to go round between those who are claiming that there is fake news and the others, the press, who argue that they have a responsibility of the freedom of the press to inform the people. The media as a whole is held in low esteem by the public, exceeded only by the lower esteem that the public has for Congress. But it is for other reasons that I shall argue that if the public is not well informed, it is not the media that should carry the blame of failing the people. Now, first, a few points about the motion itself. And I really ask you to pay attention to the wording. It is carefully worded. The wording, if, at the beginning, invites us to ask ourselves whether indeed the health of a democracy does depend upon a well-informed public. We then need to ask, what do we mean by well-informed? And thirdly, and this is the real question before us, for the health of a democracy, whose role is it to ensure that the public is well-informed? And there are other aspects that invite probing attention. What do we mean by the media? Steve has outlined that, and I'm going to outline it in some rather greater detail. And what is its or their current standing in the eyes of the public? Now, my learned opponent here rambled on and waved various bits of paper and referred to facts, but he didn't give you much facts, so I'm going to give you some real facts. And I ask you to bear with me through a bit of history to describe how we got here. In 1983, there were some 50 corporations of one sort or another dominating the mass media market, by which I mean for this television, radio, and the printed press. By 1987, those 50 had reduced to 29. And today, there are only 5 major corporations towering over the market: Comcast, Walt Disney, 20th Century Fox, Time Warner, and National Amusements. And it's ironic that National Amusements is the owner of CBS. There are, of course, other sources such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and PBS. But these 5 corporations own the bulk of the news outlets, magazines, and other means of conveying information, not just news, information to the public. And indeed, they do compete for our attention, and indeed, they're all in business to make profit, which in turn means attracting as large an audience as possible in order to sell advertising, as my opponent has said, or alternatively aiming at a particular segment of the market, such as the older generation who buy drugs and medicines, or the millennials who are attracted by techie gadgets, Hollywood gossip, and modern fashions. Increasingly, however, as these corporations swallowed the smaller fry, they made it clear that even the news operations have to be profitable. News and comment, simply for the sake of news, were not enough. There had to be profit, and if that meant changing the format or cutting the staff, then so be it. And all this brings us to a man called Al Primo. I'm sure some of you have heard about him. He was a TV executive in the 1980s who introduced the eyewitness news format, by which the presenter accompanies news items with comment and chat. It became known as Happy Talk, anchor banter, infotainment. And Al Primo was once described as the man, quote, who almost single-handedly changed the face of broadcast journalism. Since then, that format has been widely adapted and extended to include adversarial questioning and often contrived and combustible argument. Now, since 1972, and yearly since 1997, Gallup has been polling the following question. In general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as newspapers, TV, and radio, when it comes to reporting the news fully, accurately, and fairly? A great deal, a fair amount, not very much, or none at all. And the highest point of confidence was in 1976, when it stood at 72%. Trust and confidence stayed in the low to mid 50s until the early years of this century, but since then, they all steadily declined. And according to the latest Gallup poll, just last month, adding together the two elements of a great deal of trust and a fair amount, 27% of Americans polled have confidence in newspapers and 24% in television news. 46% amongst Democrats, 30% amongst independents, and only 13% amongst Republicans. And looking at the results from the angle of age groups, overall the results were 38% of those aged 50 and older, and only 26% ages 18 to 49. So in sum, only about 1/3 of the American public has trust in the Fourth Estate. Now, by now, you're probably wondering which side of this argument I'm on. But let me take you into another aspect of the media, namely broadcasting versus narrowcasting. And many of you might not have heard about narrowcasting. The term narrowcasting is recognized terminology in the media business, and it has emerged as the number and ways of conveying information have expanded. Cable television has exploded into many different avenues, each one talking to a specific audience of interest. Thus, religion has developed separate channels for Protestants, for Catholics, for Jews, and there are evangelical channels and others. Sports channels devoted to golf, to basketball, to football, to cycling, and yes, even to cricket. Channels devoted to shopping, show business, and Hollywood. And of course, separate channels that present political information aimed at the right wing and at the left wing. Most channels have to make a profit, as we've said before, and content and commercial advertising are carefully shaped to each audience. Thus, for instance, Viagra and Cialis are not advertised on a channel that gives instructions on how to make an orange souffle. For newspapers, the changing face of journalism has resulted in cutbacks in newsroom staff, and at the same time, a need for quicker reaction to unfolding events. And on top of all these, we've become accustomed to advocacy journalism in television, in radio, in print, and the social media. The Rush Limbaugh and the Rachel Maddow ways of presenting information and telling the stories. But this is not new. The Hearst newspapers did it, and so did the broadsheets of revolutionary years all those years ago. According to a Pew Research Center report as recently as 2 months ago, 45% of US adults now get news on mobile devices. And in the past few years, we've had the explosion of social media, blogs, and vlogs. And a proportion of young people get their news, such as it is, on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube. So individuals can now make their own news and views and spread their own information, and the situation is exacerbated by websites masquerading as reputable sources. So the challenge of distilling truth from fiction is made even more difficult. When fact-checkers issue a correction, the correction is seen by far fewer people than those who saw or read the initial incorrect story in the first place. And thus, with opinion-driven writing becoming the norm, Americans have become increasingly wary of placing trust in the established media institutions, which seem to have less reporting criteria and integrity than in the past, and also are driven to be profitable and therefore dumb down their product. And then there's also the short soundbite, the breathless delivery, which in turn breeds a limited attention span amongst many recipients. And in last year's political campaign, we often saw the media constantly chasing after the latest outrageous statement or political gossip. As CBS President Les Moonves said, spending so much time on covering candidate Trump, quote, may not be good for America, but it was damn good for CBS, unquote. So then, where do I stand on the motion before the meeting? I believe that the media does have an important role in making information and comment available to the public. Information and comment, not just news, information and comment. And in that regard, we're not faced with a paucity of information sources, but in fact the opposite, a cacophony of voices. There is no shortage of information and plenty of opportunities for the public to become well informed. And I do believe that the health of a democracy does depend upon the public being well informed. So what then is the problem? The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is us. As my opponent has said, we live in echo chambers. We live in our own information bubble. All too often, in part because of the cacophony of voices and the availability of choice, regrettably people listen to or view only those channels and sources that confirm the views they already hold. In order to be well informed, one has to pay attention to different views and political positions, even if at times this means gritting one's teeth and reading things that you don't particularly find happy, or viewing television programs that you don't agree with. Personally, I sometimes regret the plethora of voices and abhor the dumbing down and trivialization of complex issues that we see not all the time, but we do see it much of the time, with commentators shouting over each other so that one cannot understand what is being said. But the media, taken as a whole, and of course including the print media, cannot be accused of providing insufficient information. It's not just news, it's information and informed comment. No, the trouble is these days, information comes at us in tsunami-like proportions. And it is we ourselves who have the important role to make ourselves well-informed, in that we have to listen, view, read, sift, filter, and form our opinions from the wealth of information and data that confront us. And in so doing, the well-known Latin tag is applicable: caveat emptor, buyer beware. So to sum up, as I said, my opponent and his dog are barking up the wrong tree. Despite the inadequacies and flaws that undoubtedly exist, and we can both agree on that, and persist in the media, and despite the pressures they have to survive and to be profitable, I do not think that it is right to accuse them of failing to make available the information that we need. Some, yes, but not all as a group, which is what the motion implies. And as some of you have heard me say before, democracy is damned hard work. It is we, the voting public, who have to have the important responsibility to make and keep ourselves well informed. And it is when we don't take the time and don't take the trouble to do that, that the health of democracy is threatened. We cannot blame the media for our own inadequacies. So in a nutshell, the media's role is to make news, information, and comment available to us. But it is the voter's responsibility to take the trouble to be well informed. And so I shall end my intervention with a quote from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar that seems pertinent. "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves." I urge you to vote against this motion.
Well, I told you you would be not only well informed, but also well entertained. And so we have been. So we come to the part of the program now where we invite you, the audience, to express your views on the motion before the House. Once again, I emphasize this is not to be in the form of questions to the presenters. It is rather to express your own views, to attempt to influence your colleagues in the audience in the final vote on the motion before us. You may have noticed that there was not a lot of support for the media in the presentations of either the opposer or the presenter. In fact, the media came in for something of a beating in the presentations we've just heard. And so I want to ask, as you think about what you may want to say, are there no reliable or unbiased outlets? Does the profit motive warp everything? Of course, there is a cacophony, but does the fault lie with media outlets themselves, or with this, or with the system within which they operate? Are there in this room any individuals brave enough to defend the media and to say that they are performing their responsibilities? And how much of the blame for our current dysfunction, political dysfunction in this country, can be blamed on the media? And how much of the blame lies elsewhere? Those are the questions, it seems to me, that are raised by these two really excellent and stimulating presentations. And I now invite you to address yourselves and the motion before the House. There's a hand right there.
Hi. basically there's a great deal of fragmentation in terms of the presentation of the news. There are many, many news outlets, as we just heard, and you're absolutely right. It's what do we choose to listen to? Do we listen to just one outlet, or do we listen to a whole cacophony of sound from others? Also, you mentioned the local news concept of an al primo, which is very different from the concepts of the news that we're talking about mostly, which is national news and the guidance that we get from the major outlets. Local news is a completely different animal. I mean, it's the stories that bleed lead. It's the fires, it's the rapes, it's the violence. It isn't the stuff that basically we're talking about, I think, tonight. When it comes time to gather information, the major news outlets, like the Times, like the Washington Post, do check out their stories. But unfortunately, many of these stories that come from other small newspapers, groups, may not be honest. They may take a different point of view, and they have their own audience. Their audience disputes anything that goes against the values that they propose. And this is the problem that we face, having many, many choices to make. Do we really make good choices?
Thank you.
I was happy that the gentleman who spoke last was discussing the fact of a healthy democracy, meaning voting, because when I read the proposition, that was what I got out of it, is the media doing its job to inform voters about the issues that are important in an election. And if a third of the people believe that the media is doing a good job or can be trustworthy, that's significantly more than vote in anything but presidential elections, so that might be a good thing. That's one of the failures of our democracy, is the incredibly low voter turnout, as low as 10% in a lot of elections. And who is informing those people about the important topics that they might be wanting to vote on and actually just show up? And I'd also like to say that I don't think there was ever a golden age of media. I think it was always racist, misogynist, bellicose, and demonized Native Americans, and led to pretty much every war we've ever gotten into. So I don't know if they've really performed a role that was terribly positive, but unfortunately, they're the best thing we've got to help us make decisions in this society.
Thank you very much.
I would speak up to defeat this motion because as Derek presented, made me think of America's food industry, the supermarkets, convenience stores, great agriculture. Are they doing a good job in feeding a healthy America? The obesity epidemic would say no. But if you go down the supermarket shelves or convenience store or farmers markets, wherever you shop, and you inform yourself, if you read the labels and see what's in the food you're eating, you can stay healthy, you can eat healthy. You can eat healthy. You can eat healthy news the same way that you can eat healthy in America. Or you can actually undo your health by absorbing some of what's being said. The media, you just have to make your choices, and the choices have to change at times. This gentleman mentioned the Washington Post and the New York Times. I grew up in the New York Times family, read it all my life since I could read, but they did not cover the invasion of Iraq and our time there very well at all. The Wall Street Journal, more conservative, more in favor of the then president, did a much better job of translating for us the import of the war in Iraq. So you just have to be diligent in seeking out right information.
A fascinating analogy. Ralph Colin.
Full disclosure, I worked for 31 years for a company that was owned at various times by CBS, by Time Warner, and by Sony. I am not going to try to defend the media tonight, although I don't find that it's as guilty as Peter suggested. I think if there's an enemy at all, it may be our system of education, which nowadays is propagandized by those, or many of them, who teach. Therefore, we are taught from the time we are very young that one should take a position that is suggested by those who are getting our attention in school. But I think that Derek has it right, that we have a responsibility of our own. We exercise it in other ways. We get to choose the restaurants that we want to go to. We don't go to just one. We depend upon a number of them. And when we open the menu, we make choices. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, you probably have more than you do at a smaller restaurant that is considered a gourmet restaurant. But we make those choices, and I think we have that same responsibility about deciding what we should believe, what we can believe. We have to inform ourselves from many, many different sources, and then use our own expertise, if you will, or certainly our own judgment as to what we should believe. We can't depend on the sources. They make the information available to us, but it's our responsibility to decide what is real, what is fake, if it is fake, and what we believe, based on our experience, is what is likely to be true.
Do I take it then, Ralph, that you urge support or opposition to the motion?
I oppose the motion, but not the speaker who proposed it.
I think maybe if we're listening to ourselves, we're getting a sense of the American public, and surprisingly, that people here do not feel that the media is failing in its job. They quite overwhelmingly, at least so far, feel that the media is doing its job. And I saw a poll, of course we don't know how accurate the poll is, maybe I'm being taken in, that surprised me, and that was that 70% of the people polled thought that the media was doing its job in preventing government from doing what it should not be doing, rather than preventing it from doing its job. And I think the media is, in fact, doing its job for the reasons that Derek mentioned. And I think if I think back to Walter Cronkite, I think we understood nothing listening to Walter Cronkite. We understood the headline, we understood the surface of the events, we knew nothing about what was going on behind it. We had no sense really of a possible alternative view of things. We didn't hear alternative views. There was no analysis, no muckraking, no exploratory journalism. There was just superficial reporting. So I think we're doing much, much better now. I do agree that social media is a disaster, for more reasons than I want to go into here, and in many, many ways, but in this way in particular. I think it's killing democracy and killing America.
I believe the media fails because they are not providing us with a basic set of facts. Two of the last three speakers spoke of certain facts they count on, menus, nutritional facts. Our problem is our politicians give us a story, which may or may not be true. News media gives us stories that may or may not be true. There is just a huge sea of information, much of which is not true. We don't know what the facts are. When I grew up in Nashville, we of course had broadcast media. We had two newspapers. They presented the same set of facts and a different set of opinions on the opinion page. That was the news, the media doing its job.
Last summer I was at Yankee Stadium and sitting next to Sean Hannity. And I don't particularly like him, and he, during the seventh inning stretch, would stand up. And I turned to him and I said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" And he said to me, "No." I said, "Do you really believe all that stuff that comes out of your mouth every night?" And he started to laugh. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" He says, "It's show business." Having said that, I'm a journalism major, was a journalism major, and I interned at the New York Times. And I will argue very strongly that there are two forms of media in this country: the mainstream media
Washington Post, and major newspapers that have been around for a long time, that have a huge amount of integrity. When we were at the New York Times, you had to do a story, what, when, where, why, and how. And you fact check your facts 5 and 6 times. The New York Times, to this day, is accurate. The opinion is on their editorial pages, but their facts are as clean as possible. When you have a Huffington Post, which is arguably left, and a Fox News, which is arguably right, then you're going to get slanted. But the mainstream media, the mainstream media, I truly believe, to this day, look at the facts, try to report the facts as best that they can, and the investigative reporters on there are doing their duty and doing their due diligence.
Recently, the media did a great job in producing the information necessary for the voters of Arlington, Vermont, to make a decision. Only 5% of the voters came out to vote for a $7.5 million school budget. 65 voters out of 1,843 voted. On the other hand, in Vermont, and I'm sure in other places, another form of media is taking place, and that is the digital media. We in Vermont have a system or a media outlet called Vermont Digger. 10 years ago, it had 1 reporter. Today, it is the largest news gathering source in the state of Vermont, with 15 reporters doing a great deal of investigative reporting, and you know they're doing well when they have a huge budget of attorneys on call now to get information from the government because under the Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you.
I'm a party to a mixed marriage. My wife reads the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal. But I think the speakers were very good at pointing out the change from a few speakers on the Sunday night news or whatever to the multiple media we have today. I wasn't a Walter Cronkite person, I was a Walter Winchell person, if any of you remember. And whatever he said was the news of the country. And we were much more unified in understanding what was important. I think what's happened is somebody said that the elite are living in a balloon and are missing what's going on in the country. The whole newspaper bias toward the Democratic Party, shown in the Times and the Washington Post, etc., and the whole fragmenting of the country has been an outgrowth of the multiple sources. And as you say, the public used its own head and ignored both of them. And I think that speaks well for the public.
I realize that this would probably go against the views of 95% of people here. But the thing I learned the most here tonight was the concept that the media has to make a profit. And they will do anything to ensure that they're going to get a profit. With the man over there who said he interned at the New York Times and they get it 5, 6 times and 5 or 6 fact checks, why is it then therefore that 93% of the news articles during the past election cycle of the New York Times and the CNN were anti-Trump? How could they be giving the news to people if they're not giving both sides of the story? It's all negative from that side. Now, I'm not saying I'm for Trump or for Clinton, but it's been one-sided.
Now, just in light of what everybody said about profit motive and the bias and all that, I just really want to put in a plug for NPR, which nobody has mentioned, because I think in light of the media, they have the most informative, well-balanced, their radio, their television. I think that they are the gold standard for the media at this point in time.
I think it's also worth mentioning that the British approached this whole question quite differently by establishing a public information outlet, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and making it nonprofit, putting it under government aegis, but no form of government censorship. And NPR and PBS in this country have attempted to some degree to emulate that. And I don't know whether any of you have the opportunity to listen to BBC on a regular basis, but I think they continue to be the global gold standard for balanced journalism, at least broadcast journalism.
I would like to say I agree with Derek. I'm against the proposition. Sorry, Peter. I think Derek is absolutely right. We are required as citizens to think. We are required to listen to as much as we can and make sense of it and use logic and responsibility to figure out what is true and what is right and what is wrong. Pursuant to what somebody at the back of the room said, I think the media does have a responsibility, along with schools, to teach civics and to somehow impress people who are not easily impressed that maybe they're not right and they ought to come out of their closets. Thank you.
I think that ask yourself the question, is the failure of our governmental system, call it democracy, the result of the failure of the media, or is it much more deep-seated than that? And I think that begins to give you a reason why one should oppose this proposition. The media may not be doing its job, but the problems are much deeper, and many people have spoken to the media is supposed to supply, as Derek pointed out, information and comment. But there has to be somebody on the other side who wants and understands that information and content. And that takes us back to education, but not just education in general, but education in the elements of civics. And I would propose, I oppose this proposition, but it seems to me we are not going to get at an answer to our problems of democracy until we have a better informed public. That's not going to happen by the media. It's going to happen because in graduating from high school, everyone must pass the same exam that immigrants have to pass in understanding not just elections, but our form of government and what makes it work. The last comment is that in some sense it's deeper than that. Why should I bother to try to understand the workings of our government if before my eyes I see the role of money in politics determining the outcomes, and I am an innocent bystander? It doesn't matter whether I understand or not.
I was a teacher, and I agree. Our students were not taught social studies, civics, history in an analytical way. They were taught by rote, for the most part. Critical thinking is something that really needs attention to. And I think that's got to be done soon. Incidentally, I'm going to ask a show of hands here. How many people in here subscribe to The Economist? Wow.
To The Economist, how many people?
So well informed. If I ask this question at Madison Square Garden on an entertaining night, I assure you that percentage of hands would not go up.
I dropped my subscription when they supported the
what I'm trying to indicate is The Economist is not very entertaining to most people. Entertainment is what the media has been accomplishing, and they've been doing a good job of it. We have to teach young people to look at the media and to filter out what is necessary and what they need and not do it.
But if you think The Economist doesn't have a point of view, you're kidding yourself. Yes, Lou.
I'm also going to speak against the motion and pick up on a couple of themes of the prior speakers. It seems to me that with technology, there are so many more sources of information, which requires a more educated citizenry, not less. And at the same time, as other speakers have said, we seem to be investing less in education. And I think it takes more than just civics education. So, I mean, while I agree completely with what Bruce had to say, I think the next speaker made a very good point about critical thinking. Without the ability to take in all of the information that's there, provide some critical thinking around that, and form an opinion about what is the best place to be and how to come to a decision and how to take action, having all the information really doesn't do much and leads, in fact, to disconnection or to sort of the isolation cocoon. So I think, yes, the media has critics. They can do a better job, but that is really not the source of our problems. So I'm against the motion.
I still believe we all are part of the greatest country in the world. And as such, we do have the responsibility of keeping us great. But the press and media also have the responsibility of feeding us some of the good news. Today, for instance, if you read the papers, it's all full of Donald Trump Jr. doing this, how many times he met with someone, they're still investigating the elections. Whereas today, Mosul, or in the last few days, Mosul has fell, but you don't see anything about Mosul. We changed our rules of engagement. We changed our rules for commanders. There are great things happening in this country, and the press, for some reason, to some newspapers maybe, neglects the good things that are happening to this great country.
I come from the background as a former print reporter and a former journalist for BBC. When I start, and I agree that the financial aspect has changed dramatically, because I got my start in a tiny town where we had a local newspaper, and they actually paid high school students to write a weekly column. When you went to college, they followed you through. When we got out of college, they gave you a job that paid money, okay? And that was in the early 70s, and I believe at that time, the average profit that was expected from a small newspaper, a regional newspaper, was about 6%. By the time we got into the 1990s, from the conferences I went to, people were saying they were consolidating down, and they were expecting a profit of roughly 20%. Well, you can't, we couldn't run the kind of small town newspaper that elevated talent that way. Years later, I became a teacher of media production. And it's hard to find a place where the journalists and reporters and the broadcasters can get paid enough to make a living, if you're consolidating the market, if you're cutting out investigative departments, that sort of thing. But I also have to look at the rest of our society is based on profits as well. Are we getting the best? There's argument that if your healthcare is a for-profit system, but anyhow, that's basically what I had to say.
There also, from the floor, was a question, or implicit, was if our educational system was better, we would not have this problem. That prompts the question that among the most educated of American citizens are the representatives in Senate and the House of Representatives. One of the most dysfunctional functioning institutions within this country with the highest level of education. I would contend that it is deeper, Part of it resides within our culture. Part of it resides within the profit motive that generates what's broadcast. Distinctions need to be made between national and public news, as the notion of there's a single media is a dangerous, I don't think that assumption holds up. It has become so fragmented that it's difficult to generalize and come to a single opinion about as to single definition as to what constitutes the media. Therefore, I contend that frankly, Brutus, the fault lies in ourselves.
We in the state of Vermont had the opportunity at Middlebury College to present to the students on an education level two sides to their opinion, and it was rejected. How do we change that? How do we bring education back to the colleges and allow them to have an open discussion and have it not just in the media? Thank you.
I don't know whether I can express this quite right, but in defense of the proposition, I've been concerned that the media has a tendency, what do you call a herd instinct. And with the gentleman who made reference to the really one-sided reporting, negative reporting in the press and the news media about our current president, the media, when you look back, allowed a very prominent, dominant alpha male to suck the air out of the reporting process. There was just one person that the media was concerned with. In that sense, I believe the media is failing, or failed in this instance, because the reporting became entirely one-sided. That is, it concentrated on one person out of a bunch. The similar thing happened when the media sort of fouled up during the Gulf War, the lead up to the invasion of Iraq was very one-sided. You never heard much in the way of commentary about, are we doing the right thing? In other words, the media is not, it isn't the beginning and the end. It has its failings. And the herd instinct, the rush to get off and get onto one subject and not let go of it, detracts from everything else, including the good things that go on in this world. So, to some extent, the media has failed and is continuing to fail because of the emphasis on getting the story out, and if it's a good story, stick with it and forget the rest of the stuff.
So I'm going to take the position that starts off with acknowledging that the arguments by both propositions were coherent, cogent, they stand their ground well. And I'm also not going to speak on any editorializing of our current events, though many of the positions articulated here are valid unto themselves. I want to talk about the argumentation. So let me start by saying, I like Peter. There are two weaknesses to his argument. One is the constancy of the profit motive. The profit motive was there when we had three pre-digital news networks, news organizations. It's true that many of them bore the brunt of lost leadership, as they say in the business world, right? But nonetheless, many of them, particularly during heated times of events, such as the Vietnam War, carried pretty much their own weight. So for the profit motive to be one of the principal thrusts for this poor state of the media, you would need to demonstrate that that profit motive is relatively new. And I don't believe it is. Second, I'm told by my colleagues in U.S. history that newspaper coverage of the 1830s and 1840s election was one decade-long bloodbath with ad hominems, the likes of which we haven't experienced yet. And third, in 33, let me just say that I am not one of those who equates the development of fascism in Europe with anything that's going on here. I have too much respect for historical and political developments to make that easy equation. And in 1933, Mr. Hitler wins enough votes to become chancellor. The readership of Der Sturm was microbial. Nobody read the rag of the Nazis, but he got elected. And he got elected by an electorate that was, for any number of reasons, prepared for that experiment. In that regard, the problem isn't us. We is us. It's not a problem until it becomes a problem. But I think you must keep in mind that in the 18th century, democracy meant, by everybody, not just the nobility, meant chaos. That's what the word meant. So we're more democratic. We're not chaotic, but we are more democratic. And those are the folks who listen and read, or don't listen and don't read. But the profit motive is a constant. I like you.
Thank you. Good. Okay, it is time to invite Peter and then Derek to summarize their positions and to do their level best to persuade you that they are right.
Education. My goodness. You can't come to an educated decision without information. We are living in an era of the most educated workforce, the most educated voter set the United States has ever had. You cannot come to an educated decision without good information. There's no one sitting in this room who would deny that fact, and that's my point. That's my whole point. We've got an amazingly informed public, over-informed public. In psychology, there are two things I didn't raise earlier. There's the paradox of choice, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Paradox of choice is when you go into some place to buy something, you're presented with a whole array of things. Toothpaste is always the example I use in the textbooks. I don't know why. I go to the supermarket to buy toothpaste. There's 100 tubes of toothpaste. I leave without any toothpaste because I couldn't make the choice. Okay? It's a cardinal rule of marketing. You only put 7 tubes up there. The minute you have too many outlets of news, even an educated public is not going to make a good choice. It's simply not. Second, and I'm going to mispronounce this, homophily. There you go. I give it my best. What is that? That means we as human beings, educated or not, have a tendency to flock together. We gather with people, friends, like the people in this room. I know so many of you. You gather together, we discuss things, we talk to people we know are going to give us the right answer. We do not. So many of you have said, oh no, it's our fault. We need to go and spend all that time to compare and contrast. Nonsense. How many voters actually have that amount of time to gather that amount of information and know at the end of the day what they're looking at is a fact? They tend to go and get it from their friends, which is why social media, somebody said, so I was shocked. Somebody said social media is a terrible thing. Social media is where we get our information from now, but precisely because there's such an abundance of other media, the traditional media, that we are forced to look to friends to get our information. We live in echo chambers. Let's acknowledge it. We live in echo chambers. I'm going to leave you with a quote. Well, actually, I've got 2 things I want to tell you. Rick Rutter. He's a wonderful person. He was the media has become so obsessed with the failure of media, which I'm shocked you guys are missing. But the media has become so obsessed with the failure of media, it's now started interviewing people about the failure of media. Rick Rutter was a voter in New Hampshire, got interviewed, and he made this quote. I'm sure it's not original to him, but he said, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed. What the heck am I supposed to do? What the heck? How does he know? How does Rick know he's well informed? And how do you know he's well informed? You have to support this proposition. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Oh, no. Is this counted as his 5 minutes? Yes, it counts as 5 minutes.
Now, those of you who've seen enough BBC courtroom drama will know where this is going. Mr. Presiding Officer, I wish through you to address the members of the jury, for that is the capacity in which you all are here this evening to consider your verdict on this evening's motion, not on what my colleague has put forward about news. There's more than that. And it's more than just newspapers, it's actually magazines, it's informed comment, it's articles, it's books, it's the whole lot. I'm reminded of J.K. Galbraith's remark, it's great to be with Bill Buckley because you don't have to think. He takes up a position, you automatically take up the opposite position, and you know you're right. Now, I would not normally go as far as that regarding my distinguished and rather loquacious opponent. Nevertheless, thanks to him sending his dog to bark up the wrong tree this evening, it falls to me to rescue this exchange from the ravages of sophistry that he has presented to you. We could discuss on another occasion whether the vast majority of the public are willing to devote the time and take the trouble to ensure that they are well informed, but I remind you that is not the question for this evening. That is not the question. As with all juries, it is important to bear in mind the wording of the charge. This evening, the motion invites us to focus on whether it is the role of the media to ensure that the public is well informed, and, as I believe I have adumbrated well enough, that is not the media's role. The media's job is to provide information and news and comment, which it does exhaustively and exhaustingly, but the rest is up to us. I think it was Groucho Marx who once said, television is very educational. As soon as it's switched on, I go to another room and read a book. All very well. But for the voters seeking to exercise their civic duty, that is a cop-out. A healthy democracy requires much more from us than that. And as I've already set out, such is the plethora of choice that making ourselves well-informed is not easy. Not because there is insufficient information, but because there is often too much. Our role and responsibility is to inform ourselves, and it is all the more important precisely because of the flood of information and comment that is available. Now, as many of you will know, I do have a habit of seasoning my perorations with wise words from the past to spice up my points. I shall therefore end with two more quotes, both of which, in their own ways, highlight the importance of personal responsibility. The first is from Thomas Jefferson, Minister to France, writing to Edward Carrington, representative of the state of Virginia at the Continental Congress in 1789. And it's his last sentence which is most telling. The basis of our government being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them. The second is from the character, I return again to my old friend William Shakespeare. The second is from the character Iago in Othello. A fig! 'Tis in ourselves that we are thus, or thus. Our bodies are our gardens, to the which our wills are the gardeners. Should we plant nettles, or should we sow lettuce, seed hyssop, and upweed thyme? Should we should we supply it with one gender of herbs, or furnish it with many? Either to have our garden sterile with idleness, or manured with industry. Why, the power and corrigible authority of all that depends upon our wills. So while we may be annoyed with the media for many, many reasons, from its wide variety of television, radio, newspapers, magazines, and the social digital world, there is actually no dearth of information. The media offers us a smorgasbord of choice, a cornucopia of offerings, but it is not the media that has the role and responsibility to ensure that we are well informed. It is we who have to make the effort and do the work of reading, viewing, and listening to be well informed. It's up to us. So, members of the jury, I ask you to help me invite our friend and his dog down from the tree. And I ask you to oppose this motion and vote against. Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it. The great GMALL debate of 2017 is now before you for a decision. Yogi Berra, whom nobody has quoted yet tonight, said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. You all know that. Well, it's time to take it. So, I ask you by show of hands, who here is in favor of the motion? Repeat the motion? If the health of a democracy depends upon a well-informed public, the media is failing in its role. Who is voting in favor of that motion? There's a caucus in the back corner there. You can put your hands down. May I have a show of hands for those who oppose the motion? The nays have it. In closing, I want to say two things. The first is you have been a marvelous audience. You've done a great job of contributing to our understanding of this complex and vexing issue. And the second thing I want to say is that a year ago, when these two gentlemen debated one another, Peter emerged victorious by a considerable margin. It's now 1-1. I see it coming. 2018 is the rubber match. See you all then. Thank you.